So today I want to talk about Mars in each house. But before I do, I want to say that your birth chart is not outside of you. It's a map of your inner world. And most people look at the birth chart as something that's happening to them, but it's actually a reflection of what's happening within you. And once you understand that, astrology starts to make so much more sense. So welcome to Starwell Astrology. My name is Shari, and I'm a Western tropical astrologer with a very special interest in shadow work. On this channel, I explore astrology through deeper lens, looking at the patterns that shape how we think, feel, and experience life. I love to explore esoteric mysticism and astrotheology. So, if that's something you're interested in, make sure to subscribe, like, and share. And if you want to go deeper into this work, I host a free shadow work circle every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. And you can join through my website at starwellastro.com. I also offer a free beginner's guide to shadow work along with a bonus mini course. If you want to download that, you can go to my website. And I need to mention also that I do offer natal chart readings and one-on-one shadow work guidance. And for more information, go to starwellastro.com. So before we go into Mars and the houses, I want to give you a way to understand what you're actually looking at when you look at your natal chart, because the chart isn't random, it's a system. Your chart reflects how you experience life from the inside out, not just what is happening to you, but how you are perceiving life, how you feel into life, how you sense life, and how you respond to it. So when I talk about astrology, I'm talking about your inner structure, a process. So the sun represents your core identity. It is consciousness itself. It is your sense of self before it gets filtered through the moon. The moon filters the identity through your emotional world, which is based on what feels safe. And Mercury makes sense of that, turning your inner state into thoughts. And Venus reflects what you value, what you're drawn to, what you believe you're worth receiving. And Mars is where all of it comes into action, how you respond and move through life. But remember, when Mars is not acting on its own, it's responding to everything happening beneath the surface. And if your Mars is retrograde, it doesn't mean less action. It means action is processed differently. There can be more reflection, hesitation, and internal movement before something is expressed outwardly. So then there's the outer layer, which is Jupiter, that reflects your beliefs, how you find meaning, how you grow, and how you expand, including your beliefs you've inherited from your family, your culture, and your environment. And then Saturn brings structure. It brings boundaries and responsibility and discipline to your reality. And it's actually what shapes your reality the way you're perceiving it. It shapes it into what becomes stable and lasting in your life. And then there's the ascendant. This is how you come across, but it's also how your inner world is perceived by others. Now, when we look at your placement in your chart, we're always looking at three things: the planet, which is what function is happening, the sign, which is how that function operates within you, and the house, where it shows up in your lived experience. So the sign reflects your inner psychology, how you process, feel, and respond. And the house reflects where life brings that experience to you, the area of life where it plays out. And every placement in your chart can be expressed consciously or unconsciously. And what we call the shadow isn't separate. It's the same energy just operating without awareness. It's operating automatically or from an unconscious state. So, shadow isn't about fixing yourself, it's about becoming aware of what's already operating within you. This is why two people can have the same placement but experience it very differently. So, when we talk about Mars in the houses, we're not just talking about action in general. We're looking at where in your life your energy tends to move and where you feel driven to act and where you may react quickly and where tension, desire, and conflict can arise. So we're also looking at where this energy can operate unconsciously and how bringing awareness to it can change how you move through those experiences. So with that understanding, let's start with Mars in the first house. Mars in the first house. So if you're looking at the chart as an inner cosmology, a symbolic map of your inner world, then Mars shows up where action happens. It shows how your energy moves, how your instincts come online, how you assert, how you defend, how you pursue and respond. And when Mars is in the first house, your action principle becomes part of your actual presence. So people don't just see it, they feel it because the first house is the house of self, identity, and embodiment. And it's a part of the chart that describes how you enter life, how you come across, how your energy meets the world before you even explain yourself. So when Mars is here, your inner fire is close to the surface. There's often something immediate about you, direct, animated, and self starting. Even if you're not loud or even if you're not aggressive, there's usually a sense that your energy is active, like it's right there, available, and ready to move. So, in the framework of your inner cosmology, Mars in the first house means a function of action is fused closely to your identity. So, this person doesn't just think about doing something, they often feel the need to move, to take action. They don't just process life internally first. A lot of the time, life is met through direct response. There can be a strong connection between impulsivity and action, instinct and identity, as well as reaction and self-expression. So the person can naturally experience themselves as someone who initiates, pushes forward, and moves first, someone who wants to win, someone who wants to be the first. So there's often a built-in sense of, I need to do this, I need to handle this, I need to go first. I'm not going to wait around forever. And this can show up physically, energetically, emotionally, or socially. Mars in the first house often gives a strong sense of direct energy, a decisive quality, and a visible drive. Other people may experience you as confident or assertive or intense, maybe even too direct and always moving fast, and may even find you intimidating. And sometimes this happens even when you don't even feel that way on the inside. And that's important because the first house placement is how others often pick up on the energy before you're fully conscious of how strongly it's coming through. So this can absolutely be someone who walks into a room and changes the atmosphere even when they're not trying to. So the shadow here is not that you have too much energy. The shadow is that the energy can move too quickly, and awareness doesn't always catch up to it in time because Mars in the first house tends to act first. It's not always in a reckless way, but it's in an immediate way. So this can become impulsiveness, reactivity, frustration, irritation, impatience, and the tendency to push before fully reading the room. So if this person have had to defend themselves early in life, Mars in the first house can also create a kind of armored presence. So sometimes what other people feel is not just confidence, it's self-protection, it's a readiness, it's hypervigilance, a body that learned to take action before it could even soften. And that's where the shadow work comes in. So, from the perspective of our inner cosmology, what's happening is that Mars function is sitting in the house of identity and embodiment. So, the action principle is not off to the side somewhere, it's right at the front. Which means your system may default to doing before reflecting or taking action before understanding what is actually being triggered. So the way through this is through awareness, but your awareness has to become fast enough to catch this. Otherwise, the pattern becomes something that just happens, or it becomes a system reaction, or the body just moves instinctively, or the words just come out and you didn't even censor it, or only afterwards you may realize what was actually going on. So the deeper lesson with Mars in the first house is not to become less powerful, it's to become more conscious inside your power. It is to notice what activates you, what provokes immediate responses, what your body does before your mind reacts, and how often your instincts is trying to protect, prove, or establish selfhood in real time. And this placement is asking you to develop a relationship with your own fire, not to suppress it, not to try to be something different than you are, or and not to apologize for it either, but to actually learn how to hold it. Because once that happens, Mars in the first house becomes incredibly efficient. The person becomes courageous, embodied, great leadership skills, especially under pressure. They can be direct, self-trusting, and able to lead from instinct without being ruled by impulse. I want to give a few brief examples of how the sign will change how Mars behaves. For example, Mars in the first house in Libra. This person will still come across strong, but the action is filtered through Libran attributes. So they may assert their charm and be socially intelligent, or they may have a great relational strategy rather than blunt force. But the shadow can be passive aggressive in frustration or anger that is just dressed up in diplomacy. So then Mars in the first house in Pisces. Here, the energy can be more fluid and porous and emotionally responsive. So the person may act from intuition, feeling, or energetic sensitivity rather than direct logic. And the shadow can be unclear boundaries, indirect anger, or reacting from overwhelm without fully understanding why. And then Mars in the first house in Capricorn, this is a very strong placement. So this can give more control, focus, and a more self-contained expression of Mars. So the person may come across disciplined, capable, and quietly formidable, but the shadow can be to be rigid, over controlling, or constantly feeling like they can hold everything together. When you're working with your Mars placement and you become conscious, something really powerful happens. The person stops being unconsciously driven by their own intensity and starts directing it. And they become less reactive and more precise, less compelled to prove strength and more able to embody it. And that's when Mars in the first house becomes magnetic in a grounded way. So the energy didn't disappear, it just became more precise. If your natal chart is your inner cosmology, Mars in the first house tells us that the fire of action lives close to the surface of the self, and it lives in your body, your presence, your instinct, and the way you are meeting life. So the work is not to get rid of the fire, is to know that when you're in the middle of taking action, is to understand why you're taking action and how to carry it consciously. Because Mars in the first house is not here to make you smaller, it's here to teach you how to embody power without becoming possessed or reactive. Mars in the second house. So if you're looking at the chart as an inner cosmology, a symbolic map of your inner world, then Mars shows us how energy moves. So, in other words, how we act, how we pursue, how you protect, how you go after what you want. So, when Mars is in the second house, the action principle gets pulled into the realm of value and survival and security and self-worth. So, this is not just about action in a general sense. It's about how a person uses energy to build stability, to get their needs met, and to protect what matters to them, and to establish a sense of value in the material world. Because the second house is a house of resources. It relates to money, possession, survival, the body, and what helps us to feel grounded. But deeper than that, it also reflects our relationship to worth, what we value, what we believe is worth effort, and how secure or insecure you feel in what you have. So when Mars is here, the person often has a strong drive around creating security, maintaining control over their resources, or proving value through effort. So the inner cosmology of Mars in the second house means the action function is working through the realm of value. So energy gets directed towards building, earning, protecting, stabilizing, acquiring, and also sometimes even defending. So this person often does not want to feel dependent or powerless or at the mercy of life. There can be a strong instinct to create tangible stability, to make something real, to materialize something that they believe holds value, and to make sure that there is enough. And they want to secure what's there. So they want to protect what feels valuable to them. And especially if they feel threatened. And this can make the person very motivated, very resourceful, very persistent. Because Mars in the second house usually does not want to take action and to move for the sake of movement. It wants to take action that produces something, something real, something tangible, something usable, something solid. And this can look like someone who is driven when it comes to money or work, or protective of their time and energy or possessions, as well as determined to build something for themselves, or they feel highly motivated by the need for independence. And they often have a very personal relationship to the effort that they make. So the person can feel like, I need to make sure I am secure, or I need to know that I can provide for myself and those I love and those that I want to protect. And, or I need to build something that belongs to me, or I need to protect what I have worked for. And because of that, Mars here can create a strong connection between action and self-worth. So effort may become tied to the identity in a very quiet and powerful way. So now the shadow here is not ambition. The shadow is when survival energy becomes reactive. So the person starts living in constant state of defense or fear of scarcity, because this is how they value themselves. So this can show up as possessiveness, scarcity thinking. So they start to hoard whatever they have or try to find value in everything. Or they can be overworking or defensive around money or very possessive about what they have. Or there can be frustration with the things that feel unstable. There can be anger that gets triggered when self-worth feels threatened, because Mars in the second house can feel deeply activated when something touches the person's sense of security, their competence, or their value. So conflict may not always be about the surface issue. It may actually be about what that issue represents underneath, such as respect or stability or worth or control or safety. This can also create a pattern where the person feels like they always have to prove their value through effort, productivity, or what they can materially create. So, from the perspective of one's inner cosmology, the Mars function is operating in the house of resource and worth. The system learns to act more strongly when something valuable is on the line. So that person can become especially activated around money, work, ownership, being undervalued, being unsupported, or feeling like they have to fight for what should be theirs. So the repeating pattern is that the system feels threatened, and so Mars will mobilize itself, and the person might push harder work harder, defend more, or be more reactive. And underneath that is often a deeper question about value and survival. Not just what do I need to do, but am I safe? Am I enough? Do I matter? Can I rely on myself? The deeper lesson with Mars in the second house is to develop a conscious relationship with effort, value, and survival energy. This placement is often learning that power is not only about force, it is about self-trust. It's about knowing your value without always having to prove it. And this is definitely an internal state. It's not an external thing in the way that Mars in the second house may see this. It's about building something solid without tying your entire identity to what you own, earn, or produce. Because when this placement is unconscious, the person can act from pressure. And when it becomes conscious, they act from grounded self-worth. And that is very different. So here are a few quick examples of Mars in the second house in different signs. So let's look at Mars in the second house in Virgo. So this person may direct their energy towards order, usefulness, being practical, being of service. They may work hard and they may focus on the detail and feel driven to be competent and efficient in how they manage their resources. So the shadow can be overworking, perfectionism, or tying self-worth too closely to productivity. Mars in the second house in Taurus, this often gives a very steady, determined, and materially grounded Mars. And the person may be persistent about building security. They're very protective of what they value. But the shadow can be stubbornness, possessiveness, or resistance to change when stability feels threatened. And one final example, Mars in the second house in Sagittarius. So here the drive may be towards freedom, growth, opportunity, expansion, a sense of adventure. So the person may take bold action around money, values, or creating a life that feels bigger and more meaningful. But the shadow side can be impulsive spending, overestimating resources, or chasing possibilities without enough grounding. So when Mars in the second house becomes conscious, everything stabilizes. The person stops fighting from a constant survival reflex and start building from grounded intention. They become less reactive around worth and more rooted in it. They're less driven by fear of not having enough and more capable of creating from what's already solid inside them. That's when this placement becomes powerful in a very embodied way because now the action is not just defensive, it's constructive. So if the chart is an inner cosmology, Mars in the second house tells us that the fire of action is working through value, security, and self-worth. It shows us where the person is learning to build, protect, and stabilize their world. So the work here is not just about money and possessions, it's about the deeper relationship between action and value because Mars in the second house is not only trying to get something, it's trying to establish something, a life that feels solid, a sense of worth that holds weight, and a relationship to effort that is rooted in self-trust rather than fear. Mars in the third house. If we're looking at the chart as an inner cosmology, a symbolic map of your inner world, then Mars shows us how energy moves, how we act, how we respond, how we pursue, and also how you defend and how you might assert yourself. And when Mars is in the third house, the action principle moves through the mind, the voice, communication, your perception, and your immediate environment. So this is not just about physical action, it's about mental action. The third house is the house of your thought, your speech, your learning, your information. It's about your siblings and your everyday interactions. And it's also how you process. The third house is about your mindset. So it is the way you process what is right in front of you. Mars in the third house shows how we take in our environment and how we interpret it and how we communicate back to others. When Mars is here, the person's energy often comes from their words, their mind, their tone, and the speed of their response. In the inner cosmology, Mars in the third house means that the action function is working through perception and communication. So this person tends to act through speaking, thinking, responding, questioning, debating, interacting verbally, interpreting, and mentally engaging with others around them. And this can create someone who is mentally quick, pretty sharp-minded, and could be verbally direct, maybe too direct for some, and can be highly reactive to their environment. So the person may feel like they need to say something, or they need to respond, or they need to figure things out from a mental perspective, like have a plan or an idea, and they need to make sense of what's happening right now. So Mars here often creates movement through the mind first, or through speech as an immediate form of action. So words become active, thoughts become sharp, and the voice becomes a tool of assertion. So Mars in the third house can show up as a fast mind, a sharp tongue, strong opinions, could be direct communication, or a person who speaks with force or confidence or with a sense of urgency. So this can be someone who doesn't sit with what they think, and often they just express it impulsively. There may be a natural tendency to speak quickly and to react verbally, or to interrupt others, or try to debate or challenge or immediately name what they see. And sometimes this person comes across as mentally intense, not necessarily because they mean to be confrontational, but because this energy is active in the realm of communication. So people may feel that this person is very alert, very engaged, and very quick to respond. Now, the shadow here is not intelligence or directness. The shadow is when the mind becomes combative and restless and reactive and overstimulated, because Mars in the third house can create a system that is always on. It's always scanning, it's always processing, it's always ready to answer, defend, explain, push back, debate, interact. So this can become argumentative, impatient in conversations, speaking before thinking, mental agitation, reactive communication, or using words as a weapon without fully realizing it. This placement can also show someone who gets easily irritated by misunderstanding or slowness or lack of clarity, or people who seem mentally passive. And depending on the rest of the chart, this can also point to attention around siblings or early learning environment, or growing up in a space where the mind had to stay alert. So, from the perspective of inner cosmology, Mars function is sitting in the house of perception and communication. So the system learns to act through the mind, to defend through speech and through language, and to move energy by talking and thinking and naming and reacting. This means the repeating pattern gets perceived, the mind activates immediately, words come fast, the tone sharpens, and the nervous system mobilizes. And only afterwards does the person realize how charged they actually were. So the issue is not always what was said on the surface. Sometimes the deeper issue is the person's entire system becomes activated through mental and verbal engagement, and the body may not even realize it's in a reactive state because the energy is moving so quickly through the mind. So the deeper lesson with Mars in the third house is to become conscious of how power moves through your voice and through your mind and through your perception. This placement is often learning that words do things, like the tone that you're using can leave an impression, or the timing of how things are said. And the way you receive something shapes how you respond to it. So the work here is not to stop being sharp or expressive or mentally active. It's to become aware of what activates your mind, what triggers the immediate verbal response. Notice how your perception affects your reaction. When communication is coming from clarity versus irritation, because oftentimes this placement is unconscious of what's happening before they act. So the person may speak from activations and not be conscious that this is triggering something much deeper. But when it becomes conscious, they can speak with precision. And that is where Mars becomes incredibly effective. Now, I want to give a few examples of Mars in the third house in different signs. So, Mars in the third house in Cancer. This person may communicate from emotion, from protectiveness, and from instinct. So, their words may come from what they feel rather than what they have fully processed. So, the shadow can be defensiveness or indirect anger or reacting emotionally before they've had time to understand what was really triggered. For example, Mars in the third house in Aries. This gives a very direct, fast, and instinctive mental style. The person may speak boldly, may think quickly, may react immediately, and the shadow can be impatience and interrupting or argumentative tendencies. So they may say things on impulse and then have to deal with the impact later. So Mars in the third house in Gemini. Here, Mars becomes highly mental. It's quick, it's curious, verbally active, and the person can be sharp and witty and persuasive and constantly moving through ideas. But the shadow side is that they can be restlessness and scattered energy and verbally impulsive, or they can use language in a way that becomes cutting or insistent or overstimulated. So when Mars in the third house become conscious, the person stops reacting through the mind and starts directing the mind. And they become less mentally scattered and more mentally focused, less reactive in communications and more intentional with what they say. They can be less driven by the need to immediately respond. They're more able to speak from grounded clarity. And that's when this placement becomes powerful because now the voice is not just fast, it's effective. Now the mind is not just active, it's directed. So if the chart is an inner cosmology, Mars in the third house tells us that the fire of action is moving through the mind, the voice, and the way the person engages with their immediate environment, their surrounding world. So it shows us where energy becomes language, where instinct becomes thought, and where reaction becomes communication. So the work here is not to silence yourself, it's to become conscious of the force behind your words. Because Mars in the third house is not just about speaking up, it's about learning how to use your mind and voice in a way that is sharp, clear, and powerful without letting every thought become a reaction. Mars in the fourth house. So if you're looking at the chart as an inner cosmology, a symbolic map of your inner world, then Mars shows us how energy moves, how you act, how you defend, how you pursue, how you respond when something gets activated inside of you. And when Mars is in the fourth house, that action principle moves through the emotional foundation, the private self, the home, the family system, the deeper roots of your psyche. And this is not usually the most public expression of Mars. This is Mars operating underneath the surface because the fourth house is the base of the chart. It relates to home, family, origins, our emotional security, our inner foundation, and what is happening within you when no one else is watching. So when Mars is here, the person often carries a lot of energy internally, a lot of fire, but as a private self, a part of activation in the emotional body, and very often a strong instinct to protect what feels personal, vulnerable, or deeply theirs. So In the inner cosmology, Mars in the fourth house means the action function is operating in the emotional root system. So the person may act through emotional instinct, defensiveness, protection, feeling territorial. Also, they have like a private drive, and their reactions are deeply personal. So this can create someone whose energy is not always obvious at first. But when something touches the inner foundation, the reaction can be strong because Mars here often says, I need to protect myself. I need to protect my space, my privacy. I need to defend what's mine. And I need to respond when something hits close to home. So this placement can make a person deeply protective, emotionally reactive, and privately intense. So a lot of the fire may live below the surface. And depending on the person, it may not come out until something feels threatening, intrusive, or emotionally unsafe. So Mars in the fourth house can show up as strong emotional reactions, protectiveness around home and family, a need for control in the private environment, or a person who is much more intense in private than they appear in public. So they can also look like someone who puts a lot of energy in creating a secure home base or handling family matters or trying to establish emotional control in their inner world. Sometimes this person is outwardly calm, but inwardly activated. And sometimes the opposite is true. The private self is where all the frustration, irritation, and unprocessed anger comes out. So there can also be a strong connection to family imprinting here, especially around conflicts and survival patterns, emotional defensiveness, or what was modeled in the home growing up. So now the shadow here is not emotional depth or protectiveness. The shadow is where Mars becomes trapped in the inner world and starts operating through defensiveness, buried anger, emotional reactivity, or unresolved family patterning. Because Mars in the fourth house can hold heat. And if that heat is not understood, expressed, or worked with consciously, it can become moodiness or suppressed anger or passive aggression, or maybe even emotional volatility. There can be conflicts in the home or feeling constantly on guard in private. This placement can also point to a person who learned early on that they have to defend themselves emotionally. They had to protect their vulnerability or stay prepared for tension in the family field. So sometimes Mars here is not just action, it's protection, it's memory, it's inherited survival energy living in the root system. From the perspective of inner cosmology, Mars function is sitting in the house of roots, home, and emotional foundation. So the system learns to mobilize when something feels personal, not just convenient, but personal. So the repeating pattern may look like something touched on an old emotional nerve, and the body reacts, and defensiveness rises, anger or frustration moves underneath, and the person feels activated before they fully understand why. And because the fourth house is so deep, the reaction may not always seem proportional on the surface. That's because the trigger is much older than the moment that it is experienced. So this placement can carry ancestral intensity and family conditioning or unresolved emotional survival patterns that get activated in present time situations. So the deeper lesson with Mars in the fourth house is to become conscious of the fire in your emotional foundation. Displacement is often learning what actually makes you feel unsafe, what causes defensiveness in your private self, how anger lives in your body and home space, and what early conditioning taught you about conflict protection and emotional survival. So the work here is not to stop feeling deeply, but to build an inner foundation that can hold heat without being ruled by it. because when this placement is unconscious, the person may react from old emotional imprinting. But when it becomes conscious, they develop real emotional strength, not just reaction, not just defense, but grounded inner authority. So I want to give a few quick examples of Mars in the fourth house in a few signs. So Mars in the fourth house in Leo, for example, this can give strong pride, intensity, and emotional fire that feels private. And the person may be protective of their home, their family, their personal world, and may need to feel respected in intimate spaces. So the shadow can be dramatic reactions, pride-based defensiveness, or conflict when they feel unseen or emotionally dismissed. Mars in the fourth house in Scorpio. This is a very deep and private and emotionally intense Mars. So I always like to say that Mars in Scorpio is already very strategic. So when this is connected to your emotions at a much deeper level, this can be connected to powerful survival instincts and a strong protective energy with a lot happening beneath the surface. It's almost like whatever you act on, it's never just an unconscious action. So there's always some deeper strategy behind it. And a lot of times it has to do with how we're manipulating the situation on a psychological level, whether or not you're conscious of this, because the fourth house is a very deep house that's tied to conditioning that you're not necessarily aware of. So the shadow can be buried in anger or controlling issues or emotional secrecy or unresolved family wounds that hold a lot of charge. So Mars in the fourth house in Aquarius. Now here, the emotional action principle is detached. So it's unpredictable and it is also being filtered mentally. So the person may find freedom in their home and strong boundaries around their inner world or space to process privately in their own way. But the shadow can be emotional distance, sudden defensiveness, or reacting from internal tension while appearing unaffected on the outside. So when Mars in the fourth house becomes conscious, the person stops being unconsciously run by what's happening underneath the surface. They start building a steadier relationship with their inner fire. They become less reactive in private, more rooted, less controlled by emotional defense, and more capable of responding from self awareness. They feel less burdened by inherited patterns because they've made them conscious, and they're more able to create a home within themselves. So that's when this placement becomes powerful in a real way, because now Mars is not just guarding old pain, it's protecting what's true. So if the chart is an inner cosmology, Mars in the fourth house tells us that the fire of action is moving through the emotional roots, and it lives in the private self, the home, the body's memory, the deeper foundation of the psyche. So the work here is not to get rid of your intensity, it's to understand what your inner fire has been protecting. Because Mars in the fourth house is not just about emotional reactivity, it's about learning how to create inner safety so that your power no longer has to live in defense. Mars in the fifth house. So if you're looking at the chart as an inner cosmology, a symbolic map of your inner world, then Mars shows us how energy moves, how we act, how we pursue, how we initiate, how desire, instinct, and will begin to express themselves. And when Mars is in the fifth house, that action principle moves through creativity, self-expression, pleasure, romance, play, what brings us joy, and the need to create for ourselves. So Mars in the fifth house is more expressive because the fifth house is the house of creative life force. And it is where you radiate, it's where you're willing to take risks and have the courage to take the risk. It's how you express what's inside of you. It's how you pursue what you're passionate about. what you enjoy. It's also what you love. It's performance, arts, creativity. So when Mars is here, the person's energy wants to express something in a very visible way. So this placement usually does not want to stay hidden. It wants to create and express and pursue and be felt and to act on desires. So in the inner cosmology, Mars in the fifth house means the action function is operating through self expression and desire. So the person may act through creativity, passion, romance, performance, taking risks, finding pleasure in life, or the need to express what feels alive inside of them. And this often creates someone who has with a strong urge to follow their inspiration, but not always in a disciplined or practical way. But it will feel deeply personal to that person. Because Mars here often says, I want to go forward with what excites me. I want to express what I feel. I want to create something that comes from me, or I want to act on my desires. So this placement can feel charismatic and creatively driven. There's also sexual magnetism and a strong need to experience life in a way that feels vivid and personally meaningful. Mars in the fifth house can show up as bold expression and creative intensity. It also can be playful with a passionate presence, and they can have a lot of romantic pursuits or someone who is energized by what inspires them. So this can be a person who naturally puts energy into art, performance, dating, creative projection, visibility, or anything that allows them to bring more of themselves into the world. There's often a strong connection here between action and desire. So instead of acting only out of obligation, this person often acts when they feel lit up, when something feels exciting and compelling and worth pursuing. Because the fifth house is such a personal house, there's usually is a strong need to feel that what you're doing is genuinely yours. Now, the shadow side here is not passion or creativity. The shadow is when the need for expression becomes impulsive and ego driven and attention seeking or overly identified with being desired or chosen or seen or respected. Mars in the fifth house can become very attached to acting on what feels good in the moment. So this can become impulsive in romance, drama and dating, creative frustration, needing validation through attention, or acting on desires without fully thinking through the consequences, or tying self expression too closely to external responses. So there can also be a tendency to chase intensity and excitement or chemistry without always asking whether something is actually aligned. Because Mars here wants movement through passion. If the person is disconnected from themselves, they can confuse aliveness with truth. So, from the perspective of inner cosmology, Mars function is sitting in the house of pleasure and reactivity and personal expression. So the system learns to mobilize around desire, around attraction, around inspiration, around feeling exciting and magnetic and creatively charged. So the repeating pattern may look like something sparks desire, the system comes alive, and the person pursues it. They act on it. They throw energy into it and only later realize whether it's grounded or sustainable or actually even meaningful. This placement can absolutely create brilliance. They have natural magnetism and creative fire that is very inspiring. But it also asks the person to learn the difference between authentic expression and compulsive expression, and between true desire and impulsive projection. The deeper lesson with Mars in the fifth house is to become conscious of how you move towards joy and desire and self expression. And this placement is often learning what really inspires you and and what you're trying to create through attention or romance or how desires move through your system and whether your actions are coming from creative truth or emotional hunger. So the work here is not to become less expressive. It is to become more honest inside your expression and to create from what is real, to pursue what is aligned, to enjoy being seen without needing visibility to confirm your worth. Because when this placement is unconscious, the person may act from craving. They can become over dramatic. But when it becomes conscious, they can act from creative power. And that's when the placement becomes incredibly magnetic. So I want to give a few examples of Mars in the fifth house in a few signs. So, for example, when Mars is in the fifth house in Pisces, this person may express desire in softness through imagination. They can be emotional or express themselves in artistic ways. And their creative and romantic energy may come through intuition and fantasy, also beauty, and also what they're feeling. But the shadow side can be projection, blurred boundaries in love, escapism, wanting to have too much fun all the time, or acting on emotional longing without enough clarity. So Mars in the fifth house in Taurus. Here, the creative and romantic drive may be slower, more sensual, steady, and rooted in pleasure. So the person may pursue what feels good, tangible, and emotionally satisfying, and may have a strong connection to beauty, embodiment, and physical expression. So the shadow can be possessiveness, stubborn attachments, or staying too long in what feels familiar because it's comfortable. Now, Mars in the fifth house in Leo, this can be extremely expressive, visible, and makes Mars even more fiery. So the person may actually radiate confidence and creative force and have a strong desire to be fully seen in what they create or pursue. And the shadow can be pride, drama, or attention seeking, or becoming reactive when they feel overlooked, rejected, or unappreciated. When Mars in the fifth house becomes conscious, the person stops chasing expression from a place of emotional urgency and starts creating from grounded desire. And they become less reactive in romance and more intentional, become less dependent on attention and more rooted in authentic self expression. They become less driven by the need to prove that they're desirable and more connected to the life force that naturally moves through them. That's when this placement becomes powerful because now creativity is not just performance, it's embodiment. Now desire is not just impulse, it's direction. So if the chart is an inner cosmology, Mars in the fifth house tells us that the fire of action is moving through creativity, desire, pleasure, and self-expression. So it shows us where the person is learning to act on what lights them up, to pursue what feels alive, and to create from the self, and to take risks in love and art and expression. So the work here is not to suppress desire, but to refine it, because Mars in the fifth house is not just about chasing what feels good. It's about learning how to direct your fire into what is truly creative, aligned, and alive. Mars in the sixth house. So if we're looking at the chart as an inner cosmology, a symbolic map of your inner world, then Mars shows us how energy moves, how we act, how we respond, and how you get things done. It's your instinct, it's your effort, it's your will to move through your daily life. So when Mars is in the sixth house, that action principle moves through work, through routine, through service and discipline, as well as the body and the system that holds everyday life together. So this is going to be Mars expressed through function because the sixth house is your house of daily routine, daily reality. It relates to your habits and your responsibilities. It's your health, your maintenance, how you labor, your services, and the small repeated action that shapes a person's life over time. So when Mars is here, the person's energy often gets directed towards doing, fixing, improving, organizing, solving, and staying in motion through practical engagement. And this placement usually does not like to feel useless, stagnant, or unproductive. It wants to move through action that has purpose. So, in the inner cosmology, Mars in the sixth house means the action function is operating through daily systems and embodied effort. So, the person may act through work or discipline or routine or solving problems or some kind of service or something that allows improvement or efficiency, and they may have the need to handle what is right in front of them. There is often a strong instinct here to stay engaged with life through doing and through fixing what is off, and to handle what needs attention and to move energy in practical ways. Because Mars here often says, I need to do something useful. I need to stay on top of this. I need to fix what isn't working, or I need to keep things moving. So this placement can create a person who is hardworking, capable, efficient, and responsive in everyday life. But it can also create a system that has a hard time resting. So Mars in the sixth can show up as having strong work ethics or high productivity, or a need to stay busy, or wanting direct engagement with tasks, or someone who naturally takes action when something needs to be handled. So this can be a person who puts a lot of energy into work and health and routines, as well as organization and self-improvement or managing responsibilities. There's often a strong connection here between action and usefulness. So this person may feel most like themselves when they're doing something productive, something that's necessary or effective, or solving a problem. So they may be the one who notice what is not working and what needs adjusting and what needs attention and what needs to be done now or first or in a certain order. So now the shadow here is not discipline or responsibility. The shadow is when the system becomes over identified with constant effort. Because Mars in the sixth house can create a person who is always in task mode. They're always managing, they're always correcting, they're always trying to stay ahead of what might go wrong. This can also keep the mind very preoccupied, always planning ahead. So this can become overworking, feeling irritable or impatient, or seeking perfectionism. And this can also cause burnout or frustration with inefficiency, or feeling like you can never fully relax because there's always something else to do. There can also be anger or stress that gets stored in the body because the sixth house is connected to health and daily functioning. And Mars here can show that the body absorbs pressure when life feels too demanding, chaotic, or when your routine is overmanaged. So sometimes the issue is not about workload, it's the deeper belief that rest is unsafe or that value only comes through effort. So, from the perspective of inner cosmology, Mars function is sitting in the house of routine, labor, and embodied maintenance. So, a system learns to mobilize through responsibility and through fixing and doing and through managing what's imperfect, incomplete, or inefficient, or finding solutions to problems. The repeating pattern could look something like something feels off, so Mars activates, the person works harder, they organize more, they push through, take on more, try to fix the problem, and only afterwards realizes how much internal pressure they're carrying. So this placement can create tremendous competence, but it can also create a nervous system that stays in low level activation because it is always scanning for what needs to be handled next. The deeper lesson with Mars in the sixth house is to become conscious of how effort moves through the body and through your daily life. And this placement is often learning how to relate to work, how to respond to imperfection, what happens in your system when things feel inefficient or out of control, or whether your drive to improve is coming from grounded intention or internal pressure. So, this work here is not to stop being productive. It's to build a healthier relationship with effort, to understand that discipline is powerful, but constant strain is not the same thing as strength, and to let action become sustainable, embodied, and intentional. But when this placement is unconscious, the person can act from this internal pressure. But when it becomes conscious, they can act from precision. And that makes this Mars incredibly efficient. So I want to give a few examples of Mars in the sixth house in a few signs. For example, Mars in the sixth house in Libra, this placement may direct their energy towards balance and fairness and refinement and relational harmony in their everyday life. They may work well with others, be motivated to improve systems, and put a lot of effort in keeping things smooth and functional. But the shadow side can be passive aggression, frustration that gets buried for the sake of peace, or indecision that slows their action until there is this internal resentment. So Mars in the sixth house in Leo. Here, the work energy may be more expressive, proud, and personally invested. This person may feel creative or genuinely alive in what they do and may bring strong presence to their daily efforts. But the shadow can be the ego frustration, dramatic stress responses, or feeling depleted when their work is not appreciated or seen. Mars in the sixth house in Aquarius, this can bring a more unconventional, independent, or mentally driven approach to work and routine. So the person may be energized by innovation, systematic thinking, and doing things in their own unique way. So the shadow can be inconsistency or rebellion against structure or emotional detachment from the body or internal tension from trying to stay productive without enough grounding. When Mars in the sixth house becomes conscious, the person stops using effort as a constant survival response and start using it as a tool. They become less reactive to order and more intentional in how they respond to it. They become less driven by pressure and more grounded by disciplined action. They're less likely to burn out trying to prove their value through productivity. And they're more capable of creating routines that actually support their life force. And that's when this placement becomes powerful because now work is not just obligation, it becomes alignment. Now discipline is not punishment, it becomes self-respect. So if the chart is an inner cosmology, Mars in the sixth house is telling us that the fire of action is moving through work, routine, health, and daily function. It shows us that the person is learning to direct effort, refine action, build consistency, and develop a relationship with discipline that actually supports the body and their life. So the work here is not to stop doing, but to become conscious of how you do, because Mars in the sixth house, it's not about productivity. It's about learning how to use your energy in a way that's purposeful, sustainable, and in service to what actually matters. Mars in the seventh house. So if we're looking at the chart as an inner cosmology, a symbolic map of your inner world, then Mars shows us how energy moves, how you act, how you pursue, how you defend, how you react, and how instinct and desire begin to express themselves. And when Mars is in the seventh house, the action principle moves through relationships. So this is Mars working through the realm of relationship, projection, conflict, attraction, the way we meet other people one-on-one. Because seventh house is the house of the other. It relates to relationship, intimacy, commitment, dynamics of balance, open conflict, and what we encounter through close connections. So when Mars is here, the person often experiences a lot of activation through other people. Relationships become a place where desire gets stirred, conflicts get stirred, projection gets stirred up, attraction gets stirred up, and very often the person comes to know their own Mars energy through partnership. In the inner cosmology, Mars in the seventh house means the action function is operating through relationships. So the person may act through attraction and tension and conflict, as well as chemistry and pursuit. Projection does not exist in isolation very easily. It gets activated through interaction. So the person may feel, I know what I want when someone else is in front of me, or I become aware of my anger in relationships, or I feel my desire more clearly through connection, or I meet my own assertiveness through the eyes of another person. So this placement can create a strong pull towards dynamic relationships, ones that are passionate or charged or magnetic, also challenging and deeply activating, because the self often meets its own fire through the other. So Mars in the seventh house can show up as intensity in relationships, strong attraction patterns, passionate partnerships, or conflict that arises quickly in one-on-one dynamics. Or you could be a person who draws in direct, assertive, or highly charged people. Sometimes this person is openly assertive in relationships, and sometimes they attract partners who carry the Mars energy for them. That's important because with the seventh house, there can be projection. So if the person is uncomfortable with their own anger, desires, and directness or will, they'll meet those qualities through others first. So in that case, they may say, why do I keep attracting aggressive people? Or why are my relationship always so intense and passionate and driven? Or why do people keep confronting me? When in reality, relationships is acting as a mirror for an inner Mars that is still becoming conscious. So now the shadow here is not passion or intensity in relationships. The shadow is when conflict, desire, or assertion becomes unconsciously outsourced into the relational field. Because Mars in the seventh house can create patterns around fighting for connection, or attracting conflict or power struggles in partnerships, or reactivity with partners, also competitiveness in relationships, or you're constantly meeting your own anger through someone else. And this placement can also create a person who swings between wanting harmony and unconsciously generating tension, or wanting connection but being drawn to confrontation, or wanting intimacy, but becoming activated the closer someone gets. Because relationships do not just bring comfort here, it brings activation. Relationships wake something up. And if that energy is not understood, the person may keep repeating patterns where closeness and conflict becomes entangled. So, from the perspective of inner cosmology, the Mars function is sitting in the house of partnership and the other. So the system learns to experience action, desire, and conflict relationally. That means that the repeating pattern may look like someone entering the field, chemistry builds, projection begins, desire or tension gets activated, conflict emerges, and the person finds themselves face to face with an aspect of their own fire, sometimes through attraction, sometimes through frustration, or even through opposition. So this placement often repeats patterns until the person begins to ask, what am I meeting in myself through the reflection of others that I have not fully claimed in myself? Because this is usually where the deeper work begins. The deeper lesson is to become conscious of how your fire moves in relationship. This placement is often learning how to handle conflict in close connection and how to assert your needs with another person present, or what kind of person activates your desire. or anger, and also whether you are meeting others clearly or through projection. So the work here is not to avoid intense relationships, but to become more conscious inside them, to learn how to relate without unconsciously provoking collapsing or competing or outsourcing your power. Because when this power is unconscious, the person may experience Mars as something that keeps happening to them through other people. And when it becomes conscious, they begin to own their desire, their directness, and their relational power. And that changes everything. So I want to give a few quick examples of Mars in the seventh house in a few signs. So Mars in the seventh house in Pisces, this person may experience Mars in relationships in a softer, more fluid, and emotionally porous way. They may be highly sensitive to relational energy and may act through intuition, longing, or emotional merging rather than direct confrontation. And the shadow can be blurred boundaries or indirect anger or confusion in conflict, or attracting partners who act out aggression more overtly in your relational dynamics. So, Mars in the seventh house in Aries, this creates a much more direct, immediate, and instinctive relational Mars because Mars is in its home sign. So the person may be drawn to bold, independent, passionate people and may experience relationships as highly activating and fast moving. But the shadow can be impulsive conflicts, competitiveness, impatience with the partner, or relationships that burn hot and escalate quickly. Mars in the seventh house in Scorpio. Well, this gives a deep, intense, magnetic, and highly charged relational field. So the person may experience profound attraction and strong emotional undercurrents and partnership that activate issues of trust, power, desire, and vulnerability. The shadow side can be to control dynamics through jealousy or power struggles or emotional defensiveness or relationships that become all consuming if the energy is not conscious. So when Mars in the seventh house becomes conscious, the person stops meeting their fire only through conflict or chemistry and starts bringing awareness into the relational field. And they become less interactive with partners and more direct, less likely to project unowned anger outwards, and are more able to name what they feel and what they need. And less caught in repeating power struggles and more capable of real intimacy with boundaries, honesty, and self respect. And then this placement becomes powerful because new relationships is not just a trigger, it becomes a place of conscious exchange. Now, attraction is not just projection, it becomes information. And now, conflict is not just disruption, it becomes a mirror for growth. So, if the chart is an inner cosmology and Mars in the seventh house tells us that the fire of action is moving through relationship. It shows us where the self meets its own desire, its own conflicts, its assertions and power through the mirror of others. So the work here is not to avoid relational intensity, it's to understand what relationship is activating in you. Because Mars in the seventh house is not just about attracting strong dynamics, it's about learning how to stay conscious when your fire gets stirred by another person. Mars in the eighth house. So if we're looking at a chart as an inner cosmology, a symbolic map of your inner world, then Mars shows us how your energy moves through your actions, what you pursue, how you defend, how instinct and desire begins to express themselves. So when Mars is in the eighth house, that action principle moves through depth, intimacy, power, vulnerability, merging, shared resources, and transformation. So this is not Mars operating on the surface. This is Mars moving through the underworld of the chart because the eighth house is the house of what is hidden, bonded, shared, or psychologically charged. It relates to intimacy, trust, power dynamics, energetic entanglements, loss, rebirth, crisis, transformation, sexuality, and the deeper layers of emotional and psychic exchange. So when Mars is here, the person's energy often becomes activated through intensity, through what is beneath the surface, through what is taboo, vulnerable, magnetic, or psychologically loaded. This placement usually does not want shallow engagement. They want depth, they want truth, they want penetration and realness. So in the inner cosmology, Mars in the eighth house means the action function is operating through transformation and deep energetic exchange. So the person may act through intensity, emotional depth, psychological insight, sexual energy, crisis, power dynamics, and the need to get to the root of things. They're willing to research or dig deeper to explore the buried aspects of oneself. This often creates someone whose energy gets stirred when something feels charged, intimate, or deeply consequential. Because Mars here often says, I need to know what's really going on, or I need to feel what's underneath this, or I don't trust surfaces, activated by what is hidden, intimate, or powerful. This placement can create a person who is magnetic, perceptive, private, and deeply reactive to issues of trust, vulnerability, betrayal, control, and emotional truth. A lot of their fire may come online when someone touches the deeper layers of attachment and power. So Mars in the eighth house can show up as emotional intensity, sexual magnetism, the strong instinct around trust and power, a penetrating presence, or someone who does not engage life halfway. This can be a person who naturally senses undercurrents, who feels what is unsaid, who reacts strongly to dishonesty or manipulation or exposure or betrayal, emotional avoidance. And there's often a strong need here to understand what is really motivating people. And because the eighth house is connected to merging, this placement can also make relationships, intimacy, and shared resources highly activating. So the person may not feel neutral when it comes to emotional closeness. They may feel deeply bonded and deeply guarded, or both. Now, the shadow here is not depth or intensity. The shadow is when Mars starts operating through control, defensiveness, suspiciousness, emotional reactivity, or unconscious power struggles. Because Mars in the eighth house can become hyper aware of vulnerability. And when vulnerability feels unsafe, the system may try to protect itself through control, withholding, testing, suspiciousness, or jealousy, or self defensiveness, or reacting strongly when trust feels threatened. Or there could be emotional guardedness. So this placement can also carry buried anger, not always obvious. Sometimes it goes underneath. Sometimes its intensity is silence. Sometimes it becomes emotional pressure, resentment, or the need to maintain power in order to avoid feeling exposed. And because the eighth house is always the house of transformation, Mars here can bring periods of crisis and rupture or intense inner change that force the person to confront what they have not fully processed. So, from the perspective of inner cosmology, the Mars function is sitting in the house of intimacy, power, shadow, and transformation. So the system learns to mobilize around what feels deeply charged, around trust, around exposure, attachment, betrayal, and emotional truth. So the repeating pattern may look like something touches a deeper vulnerability. The system activates, defense rises, control or reactivity kicks in, and the person feels intense emotions, desire, fear, or anger, and often afterwards realizes how much deeper the trigger actually went. Because with the eighth house, the reaction is rarely only about the moment. It's often connected to older material: fear of loss, fear of betrayal, fear of powerlessness, fear of being emotionally overtaken, or fear of what happened when the self merges too deeply without safety. So this placement often asks the person to become conscious of what intensity is trying to protect. The deeper lesson with Mars in the eighth house is to develop a conscious relationship with power, vulnerability, and transformation. This placement is often learning what truly activates your defenses, how desire and fear can become entwined, how anger lives beneath the surface, what intimacy brings up in your system, and whether you're relating from trust or from survival. So the work here is not to become less deep, it's to become more conscious inside your depth, to understand that intensity is not the same thing as truth, and that control is not the same thing as power, and that the real power often comes when you can stay present with vulnerability without immediately trying to manage, defend, or dominate the field. Because when this placement is unconscious, the person may act from survival intensity. And when it becomes conscious, they act from depth, discernment, and inner authority. And that makes this Mars incredibly powerful. I want to give a few examples of Mars in the eighth house in a few signs. Mars in the eighth house in Cancer. Here, the intensity is more emotional, protective, and rooted in attachment. The person may be deeply sensitive in intimacy, strongly reactive around trust, and highly protective of what they bond with. The shadow can be emotional defensiveness, fear of exposure, indirect anger, or holding on to old pain when the system doesn't feel safe enough to release it. Mars in the eighth house in Sagittarius, this brings more truth seeking, exploratory, or meaning driven approach to the eighth house. So the person may be drawn to deep experiences that expand their understanding, challenges their beliefs, or transforms them through intensity. So the shadow can be acting impulsively in intimate or financial entanglements, or bypassing emotional depth through philosophy, or chasing intensity without fully understanding the consequence of what's being opened. Mars in the eighth house in Virgo. This person may process intensity through analysis, discernment, and control of details. They may try to understand emotional complexity by organizing it, fixing it, or making sense of what feels psychologically messy. So the shadow can be hypervigilance, overanalyzing motives, trying to control vulnerability through perfectionism, or becoming tense when things feel emotionally undefined. So when Mars in the eighth house becomes conscious, the person stops being unconsciously ruled by depth and starts developing real power inside it. And they become less reactive in vulnerability and more capable of holding it, less controlled by fear, attachment, or power dynamics, and more able to engage intimacy with honesty and discernment. They're less likely to use intensity as an armor and more capable of letting transformation do its work without resisting it at every turn. That's when this placement becomes powerful, because now depth is not just something that overwhelms them, it becomes something they can navigate. Now desire is not just entanglement, it becomes conscious energy. And now transformation is not just crisis, it becomes initiation. So if the chart is the inner cosmology, Mars in the eighth house tells us that the fire of action is moving through intimacy, shadow, power, and transformation. It shows us where the person is learning to confront what is hidden and to work with intensity and to understand vulnerability and to develop real power beneath the surface. So the work here is not to avoid depth, it's to become conscious within it. Because Mars in the eighth house is not just about passion, crisis, and personal intensity. It's about learning how to move through the underworld of the self without becoming consumed by it. Mars in the ninth house. So if you're looking at the chart as an inner cosmology, a symbolic map of the inner world, then Mars shows us how inner energy moves, how you act, how you pursue, how you defend, how instinct and will begin to express themselves. So when Mars is in the ninth house, that action principle moves through belief, meaning, perspective, truth seeking, philosophy, and the need to expand beyond what is already known. So, this is Mars expressed through vision because the ninth house is the house of higher learning, wisdom, worldview, faith, travel, truth, and the larger framework through which a person understands life. So it shows how we seek meaning, how we orient to what is bigger than ourselves, and how we grow through perspective, experience, and the search for what feels true. And when Mars is here, the person's energy often gets activated through ideas, beliefs, purpose, and the need to move towards something that feels meaningful. So, this placement usually does not want to stay mentally or spiritually confined. It wants expansion, direction, discovery, a reason to move. So, in the inner cosmology, Mars in the ninth house means the action function is operating through world view and higher perspectives. So, the person may act through beliefs and vision or philosophy. They're set on truth seeking, exploration, teaching, questioning, and the need to move towards what feels meaningful. And this often creates someone whose energy comes alive when they're learning and discovering and traveling and teaching and pursuing larger truth. Because Mars here often says, I need to understand what this means. I need to go beyond what I already know. I need to move towards what feels true. I need freedom to explore my own path. So, this placement can create a person who's driven by conviction, not always in a rigid way, but often in a way that makes them feel strongly about what they believe and what they stand for and where they're going. So Mars in the ninth house can show up as strong opinions or a passionate mind driven towards knowledge or truth, love of movement and expansion, or someone who acts from belief and speaks with conviction. And this can be a person who naturally puts energy into learning, teaching, traveling, publishing, spiritual inquiry, or big picture thinking, as well as pursuing experiences that broaden their understanding of life. There's often a strong connection here between action and meaning. This person may not just want to act for the sake of acting, they want to feel that what they're doing has purpose, so that it's leading somewhere, so that it's meaning something. The shadow here is not passion for truth or expansion. The shadow is when conviction becomes reactivity, defensiveness, dogma, or the need to be right. Because Mars in the ninth house can become highly activated when beliefs are challenged. So this can show up as argumentativeness around ideas, preaching, moral superiority, impatience with people who think differently, or reacting strongly when world views feel threatened, or constantly needing to prove a point. This placement can also create a person who always chases the next horizon without fully grounding what they have already learned. So sometimes the issue is not lack of direction, it's an over identification with movement, certainty, or the need for expansion as a way to avoid being still with what is unresolved. So, from the perspective of inner cosmology, the Mars function is sitting in the house of meaning, worldview, and higher truth. So, the system learns to mobilize around belief, around perspective, around what feels true, and around what offers direction, purpose, and a sense of growth. So the repeating pattern here looks like something challenges the person's worldview, the system activates, Mars comes online, and the person argues, defends, pushes, teaches, reacts, or move towards a new horizon. And underneath that is often a deeper need to protect meaning itself. Because with the ninth house, belief is not always casual. It can be deeply tied to identity, origination, and the person's sense of where life is going. So this placement often asks, what happens when truth becomes a battleground? What happens when conviction turns into armor? What happens when movement becomes a way to avoid deeper integration? So the deeper lesson with Mars in the ninth house is to become conscious of how your fire moves through belief, truth, and direction. This placement is often learning what gives your life meaning, how you respond when your perspective is challenged, whether your beliefs are lived or merely defended, or whether your drive towards expansion is aligned or reaction. So the work here is not to become less passionate. It's to become more conscious inside your conviction, to know the difference between truth and performance, between wisdom and certainty, between exploration and escape. Because when this placement is unconscious, the person may act from idealized reactivity. And when it becomes conscious, they act from lived truth. And that makes this Mars powerful in a much deeper way. So I want to give a few quick examples of Mars in the ninth house in a few signs. Mars in the ninth house in Gemini. This person can pursue truth through questioning, dialogue, learning, and mental exploration. Their energy may move through ideas and through communication, teaching, writing, or constantly gathering new perspectives. So the shadow can be scattered conviction, arguing for the sake of stimulation, inconsistency in belief, or moving so quickly through ideas that deeper wisdom does not fully land. Now, Mars in the ninth house in Libra, here the person can pursue truth through fairness, balance, perspective, and relational intelligence. They may feel driven to understand different sides of an issue and may advocate strongly for justice, harmony, or principle. But the shadow side can be conflict around beliefs masked by diplomacy, or indecision about what they truly stand for, or resentment that builds when they avoid direct ideological confrontation. Mars in the ninth house in Aries, this creates a bold, direct, instinctive, and highly self propelled relationship to truth and expansion. This person can pursue their path with strong convictions or act quickly on belief or feel energized by challenge, freedom, and movement. The shadow can be impulsive, combative opinions, impatience with nuance, or pushing beliefs so forcefully that growth turns into crusading. Mars in the ninth house becomes conscious. The person stops fighting for meaning from a reactive place and start embodying what they know. They become less attached to being right and more committed to what is true. So there's less restlessness in their pursuit, and they're more grounded in their path, less likely to use belief as a weapon, and more able to let truth become something lived, tested, and integrated. That's when displacement becomes powerful, because now expansion is not just escape, it becomes evolution. Now, belief is not just defense, it becomes direction. Now, truth is not just something to argue about, it becomes something to embody. So, if the chart is an inner cosmology, Mars in the ninth house tells us that the fire of action is moving through belief, meaning, perspective, and the search for truth. It shows where the person is learning to direct their energy towards what expands them, to fight for what they believe in, and to develop a relationship with truth that is both passionate and conscious. So the work here is not to stop seeking, is to become aware of what is driving the search. Because Mars in the ninth house is not just about having strong beliefs, it's about learning how to move towards truth without turning every difference in perspective into a battlefield. Mars in the 10th house. So if you're looking at the chart as an inner cosmology, a symbolic map of your inner world, then Mars shows us how energy moves, how you act, how you pursue, how you assert. How will ambition and drive begin to take form in the world? And when Mars is in the 10th house, the action principle moves through career, public life, achievements, authority, direction, and the person's visible role in the world. So this is Mars in a very outward facing part of the chart because the 10th house is the house of status, vocation, reputation, life direction, public image, and the way a person is meant to build something tangible through their efforts over time. It shows how we relate to responsibility, recognition, mastery, and the path we carve in the outer world. So when Mars is here, the person's energy often gets directed toward something, towards building, achieving, pushing forward, establishing themselves, creating movement in their public life. So this placement does not want to drift without direction. They want purpose, momentum, and a trajectory. So in the inner cosmology, Mars in the 10th house means the action function is operating through public life and outer direction. So the person may act through ambition and leadership or visible effort. They're career driven. They take on a lot of responsibility. They have strategic movements. There's a need to establish themselves in the world. This often creates someone who feels a strong inner pressure to do something with their life, to move towards a goal, to make an impact, to create results that can be seen, measured, or recognized in some way. Because Mars here often says, I need to move forward. I need to build something. I need to take action in the direction of my life. So this placement can create a person who is highly motivated, capable, determined, and visibly engaged in the process of achievement. And there's often a strong connection here between action and purpose. Mars in the 10th house can show up as strong ambition, a driven public presence, leadership energy, decisiveness in a career matter, and someone who naturally takes initiative. They can be a person who others see as capable, serious, assertive, hardworking, or highly focused on where they're going. Even if they're not outwardly aggressive, there's always that they're moving towards something. There's a sense that they have direction and that they are not here to stay passive for long. So this placement can also bring tension around authority, either becoming an authority figure or having to work through conflicts with an authority early on. Because Mars in the 10th house wants agency in a realm of power and structure and public life. So now the shadow here is not ambition or leadership. The shadow is when the drive to achieve becomes over identified with worth, control, image, or the need to constantly prove something. Because Mars in the 10th house can create a person who feels like they always have to be moving, producing, winning, or establishing something. So this can show up as workaholism or career-based stress or frustration with obstacles, conflict with authority, impatience with slow progress, or tying self-worth too closely to achievement and recognition. This placement can also create someone who feels a deep internal pressure to succeed without always knowing where that pressure is coming from. Sometimes it comes from their genuine purpose, and sometimes it comes from old conditioning, fear of failure, fear of being significant, or the belief that power may be earned through relentless effort. So the issue is not about ambition, It is the deeper question of what success means to the person and what they believe will happen if they stop striving. From the perspective of inner cosmology, Mars' function is sitting in the house of vocation, reputation, and public direction. So the system learns to mobilize through purpose and responsibility and pressure and having an outer goal. And this means that repeating patterns may look like the person feels they need to achieve. Mars activates, they push forward, they take on more, they work harder, they assert themselves, they meet resistance, and then either become more determined or more frustrated. Because the 10th house action is rarely casual, it tends to be tied to legacy, impact, visibility, and the life path itself. So, this placement often asks, are you acting from true direction or from pressure? Are you building from inner authority or reacting to the need to prove something? Are you leading your life consciously or just staying in the motion because stopping feels unsafe? So, the deeper lesson with Mars in the 10th house is to become conscious of how your drive moves through purpose, ambition, and public life. This placement is often learning what actually motivates them or how they're able to relate to authority and responsibility, what success means to you beyond appearance, and whether your ambition is aligned with your deeper path. So, the work here is not to become less driven. It's to become more conscious inside your drive, to understand that real authority doesn't come from force alone. It comes from integrity, from direction, from embodiment, from consistency. Because when this placement is unconscious, this person can act from pressure, defensiveness, or image based striving. And when it becomes conscious, they act from purpose. And this makes Mars incredibly powerful. Now, I want to give a few examples of Mars in the 10th house in a few signs. So, Mars in the 10th house in Aquarius. This person may direct their ambition towards innovation, change, independence, freedom, doing something unconventional in the world. They may be driven to break outdated systems and to lead through original ideas and to create impact in a way that feels future oriented and different from the norm. The shadow can be rebellion against authority or inconsistency in direction or emotional detachment from ambition or pushing against structure without fully understanding how to work with it. Mars in the 10th house in Virgo. Here, the drive can move through precision and competence, service, discipline, the desire to be effective in practical ways. A person may be highly hardworking, detail oriented, and motivated to improve systems. They can have master skills or be useful in visible ways, but the shadow can be perfectionism, overworking, self criticism, or feeling like nothing is ever good enough, no matter how much they accomplish. Mars in the 10th house in Scorpio. This creates a powerful, intense, strategic, and deeply driven public Mars. This person is highly focused, ambitious, and capable of moving through career or public life with depth and resilience and strong instinct around power dynamics. The shadow can be control issues, secrecy, burnout through intensity, conflict with authority, or becoming overly consumed by status, influence, or the need to maintain power. When Mars in the 10th house becomes conscious, the person stops being unconsciously driven by pressure and starts moving with real direction. They become less reactive around status and success and more rooted in purpose, less caught in proving themselves and more committed to building something that actually reflects who they are. They're less likely to push from fear and more capable of leading from inner authority. That's when this placement becomes powerful because now ambition is not just compensation, it becomes alignment. Now, effort is not just pressure, it becomes purpose. Now, leadership is not just control, it becomes embodiment. So, if the chart is an inner cosmology, Mars in the 10th house tells us that the fire of action is moving through vocation, ambition, public life, and the path of outer achievements. It shows us where the person is learning to direct their energy towards purpose, to build something real in the world, to develop authority through conscious action. So the work here is not to stop striving, it's to understand what your striving is in service to. Because Mars in the 10th house is not just about success, it's about learning how to move through the world with direction, integrity, and embodied power. Mars in the 11th house. So, if we're looking at the chart as an inner cosmology, a symbolic map of your inner world, Mars shows us how energy moves, how you act, how you pursue, how you assert, how instinct and will begins to direct themselves towards something. And when Mars is in the 11th house, the action principle moves through groups, friendships, community, vision, collective spaces, and the future you are trying to move towards. So, this is Mars expressed through the social field because the 11th house is the house of networks, alliances, social belongings, shared causes, long term goals, and the larger vision a person is trying to grow into. So, it shows how we relate to community, how we engage with collective spaces, how we connect to the future, and how our energy moves when it is linked to something beyond just the personal self. And when Mars is here, the person's energy often gets activated through people, causes, movement, friendships, and the goals that exist beyond the immediate present. So this placement usually does not want to move without direction or relevance. They want momentum towards something larger, a vision, a future, a purpose that connects the self to something broader. So in this inner cosmology, Mars in the 11th house means the action function is operating through community ideals and future-oriented vision. So the person may act through friendships, collaborations, through social dynamics, through collective causes or long-term goals, group identity, or the need to move energy towards what they hope to build. This often creates someone whose energy comes alive when they're connected to a bigger idea, a bigger mission, or a wider social field. Because Mars here often says, I need to move towards the future. I need to work towards something larger than myself. I need to align with people or spaces that reflect where I'm going. I need to take action on my vision. So this placement can create a person who is motivated by ideals, networks, contributions, and the desire to create movement in the collective dimension of life. So Mars in the 11th house can show up as strong opinions in group settings or initiatives in communities, or they can feel driven around goals and visions, or leadership in networks, or someone who becomes energized through collective momentum. So this can be a person who naturally puts energy into friendship, social circles, collaborative projects, humanitarian efforts, online spaces, communities, or long-range dreams that they're actively trying to build towards. There's often a strong connection here between action and belonging, not always belonging in the emotional sense, but belonging in the sense of resonance, shared direction, shared ideals, shared future. So this person may feel most activated when they're around people, ideas, or spaces that reflect where they are trying to go. Now, the shadow here is not vision or social engagement. The shadow is when conflict, competition, or frustration begins to play out in the social field. Because Mars in the 11th house can create activation around friendships, group dynamics, belongings, ideological alignment, social power, or unmet expectations in community. So this can show up as frustration with groups, conflicts with friends, feeling like the outsider in collective spaces, power struggles in community, impatience with people who lack direction, or becoming overly identified with a cause, a social role, or an ideal. This placement can also create tension between individual will and collective harmony because Mars is personal and it wants movement, it wants direction. But in the 11th house, it's collective. It involves many energies, many people, and many agendas. So the person may struggle with how do I stay true to my own will while also functioning inside a group? And this is often one of the deeper tensions here. So, from the perspective of inner cosmology, the Mars function is sitting in the house of community, vision, and future direction. So, the system learns to mobilize through the social field and through group energy and through collective goals, through friendships, networks, ideals, and long term hopes. But the repeating patterns may look like the person feels energized by a vision, Mars activates, then they move toward people, groups, causes, or goals. Friction emerges, difference in values or direction show up, and the person has to confront how they assert themselves within a larger field. Because with the 11th house, the issue is not only what you want, it is also who are you becoming in relation to the collective? What are you building towards? Where does your energy belong? And how do you handle misalignments in the social sphere? So, this placement often asks the person to become conscious of how desire, assertions, and conflicts move through friendships and shared spaces. The deeper lesson with Mars in the 11th house is to become conscious of how your fire moves through community, shared purpose, and future vision. This placement is often learning what kinds of people activate your momentum, what kinds of group drain or distort your energy, how you handle disagreement in collective spaces, and whether your goals actually reflect your deeper values. So, the work here is not to stop caring about community or vision, it's to become more discerning about where you direct your life force, to know that not every group is yours, not every cause deserves your energy, and not every friendship can carry your full momentum. Because when this placement is unconscious, the person may scatter energy through social overstimulation, group conflicts, or vision without grounding. But when it becomes conscious, it becomes a powerful force of aligned movement in the collective field. So I want to give a few quick examples of Mars in the 11th house in a few signs. So Mars in the 11th house in Libra, this person may direct their energy through relationship alliances, justice, and social harmony with groups. They may be motivated by fairness and shared ideas and creating connection between people, and may take action through collaboration and diplomacy. The shadow can be passive aggression in friendships, resentment in group dynamics, or avoiding direct conflict until tension builds beneath the surface. Mars in the 11th house in Capricorn, here the action principle can move through strategy, long term planning, achievements, and structured goals within the collective sphere. And the person may be highly driven around building something lasting through community leadership and organized effort. The shadow can be control issues in groups, emotional distance in friendships, rigid expectations, or using social networks too instrumentally without enough real reciprocity. Mars in the 11th house in Gemini, this can bring a mentally active, socially agile, and ideal driven Mars. into the realm of friendship and community. And the person may be energized by conversation, networking, exchanging ideas, moving between multiple social spaces or future possibilities. The shadow can be scattered energy, inconsistency in group commitments, argumentative dynamics in friendships, or spreading energy too thin across too many people or visions. So when Mars in the 11th house becomes conscious, the person stops scattering their energy through every group, goal, or social stimulation and start directing it towards what is actually aligned. They become less reactive in friendships and more discerning, less caught in collective noise and more rooted in meaningful contributions, and less likely to force belonging and more able to find the space where their energy naturally belongs. And that's when this placement becomes powerful because now social action is not just reaction, it becomes intentional contribution. Now, vision is not just idealism, it becomes direct momentum. And now, community is not just external belonging, it becomes a field of shared purpose. So, if the chart is an inner cosmology, Mars in the 11th house tells us that the fire of action is moving through friendships, networks, collective spaces, and future vision. It shows us where the person is learning to direct energy towards shared goals, to navigate group dynamics consciously, and to build a future that is aligned with both personal will and collective purpose. So the work here is not to withdraw from the social field, it's to become aware of where your energy is truly meant to go. Because Mars in the 11th house is not just about people or goals. It's about learning how to move with others without losing the integrity of your own direction. Mars in the 12th house. So, if we're looking at the chart as an inner cosmology, a symbolic map of your inner world, then Mars shows us how energy moves, how you act, how you pursue, how you defend, how instinct and will begin to express themselves. And when Mars is in the 12th house, this action principle moves through the unconscious, the hidden self, the inner world, spiritual life, repression, solitude, and what operates beneath the ordinary awareness. So this is not Mars working in a direct or obvious way because the 12th house is the house of what is unseen. It relates to the unconscious, to dreams, to endings, to isolation, to spiritual process, to hidden patterns, to self-undoing, and to the parts of the psyche that is not always immediately accessible to the conscious mind. So when Mars is here, the person's energy often moves below the surface. It may not always be easy for them to see what they want right away, or to express anger directly, or to know exactly how their will is operating in the moment. Because this Mars is often hidden from the self before it is hidden from everyone else. In the inner cosmology, Mars in the 12th house means the action function is operating through the unconscious field. So the person may act through inner tension, dreams, through spiritual impulses, through private struggles, through hidden motivations, unconscious anger, retreat. And this process happens beneath the surface of awareness. This often creates someone whose relationship to action is more complex because Mars here often says, I feel something moving, but I may not fully understand it yet. My anger doesn't always come out directly. My energy may build in private before I know what to do with it, or there's something happening underneath the surface that drives my behavior. So, this placement can create a person who is quietly intense, inwardly driven, spiritually activated, or deeply affected by energies that are difficult to name in ordinary terms. So a lot of their fire may live in the unseen layers of the psyche. Mars in the 12th house can show up as hidden frustration, private ambition, indirect anger, strong inner life, or a need for solitude to process anger, or someone whose drive is real but not always visible from the outside. This can be a person who seems calm or hard to read while carrying a lot internally. Sometimes they act behind the scenes, sometimes they work quietly, sometimes they suppress what they feel until it leaks out in indirect ways. And sometimes this placement creates a person who is highly sensitive to the emotional or energetic atmospheres around them without immediately understanding how much it is affecting them. So their action may not always be straightforward. It may move through intuition, dream life, withdrawal, symbolic process, or hidden emotional buildup. Now, the shadow here is not depth, solitude, or spiritual sensitivity. The shadow is when Mars becomes repressed, fragmented, misdirected, or turned against the self. Because Mars in the 12th house can make it hard to access anger consciously. And when anger is not recognized, named, or integrated, it does not disappear, it goes underground. So this can show up as self sabotage, or passive anger, or suppressed rage, or exhaustion, or avoidance, or difficulty asserting needs, or feeling blocked without always knowing why. This placement can also create a person who unconsciously absorbs tension and then acts it out in indirect ways, or someone who struggles to know what they want until the frustration has already built up too far. So the issue is not lack of Mars. It is that Mars is often hidden behind the veils of the 12th house, and that can make action feel confusing and delayed or internally conflicted until it becomes more conscious. So, from the perspective of inner cosmology, the Mars function is sitting in the house of the unconscious, hidden process, and spiritual dissolution. So the system learns to mobilize through what is unseen, through dream material, through internal pressure, through psychic undercurrents, and through old pain, invisible stress, or unconscious defense patterns. So the repeating pattern may look like the person feels off but cannot fully name why, energy builds internally, or frustration accumulates below awareness. Action gets delayed, diffused, or misdirected, and then something leaks out indirectly through withdrawal, self sabotage, resentment, burnout, or unexpected reaction, because with the 12th house, the action is often happening before the ego fully understands it. So this placement often asks, what is moving in you that you have not yet made conscious? And what anger have you hidden from yourself? And what desire have you buried because it didn't feel safe, clear, or allowed? What happened when will is trapped in the unconscious instead of integrated into the self? This is usually where the deeper work begins. The deeper lesson is to become conscious of your hidden fire. This placement is often learning how anger lives in the unconscious, how unprocessed desire affects behavior, what drains energy behind the scenes, how spiritual life and instinct interact, and what happens when action is not given a clear and grounded outlet. So, the work here is not to force yourself to become more outwardly assertive all at once. It's to build a relationship with what is happening underneath the surface, to notice what your body is holding, to recognize subtle resentment before it becomes self undoing, to understand that hidden anger still shapes reality, even when it's never spoken. Because when this placement is unconscious, the person may act from invisible pressure, but when it becomes conscious, they develop a much deeper and more integrated relationship with will. And that makes this Mars quietly powerful. So I want to give a few examples of Mars in the 12th house in a few signs. So Mars in the 12th house in Capricorn, this can create a very controlled, contained, and privately disciplined Mars. This person may have a strong inner drive, but much of their ambition or frustration can be carried silently and managed behind the scenes. The shadow can be suppressed anger, isolation, under pressure, harsh self control, or carrying burden alone until the system becomes exhausted. Mars in the 12th house in Virgo. Here, the hidden Mars may move through analysis, inner tension, self correction, and a constant background effort to fix or improve what feels off. The person may be highly sensitive to subtle disorder and may process anger internally through worry, critique, or nervous system strain. So the shadow can be self sabotage through overthinking, repressed frustration, somatic stress, or difficulty expressing irritation directly. Mars in the 12th house in Aquarius, this can bring a more detached, unconventional, or mentally filtered Mars into the unconscious field. They may hold a lot of inner tension around freedom, individuality, or feeling separate from the collective. And they may act in unexpected and indirect ways when the tension builds. So the shadow can be emotional disconnection from anger, sudden withdrawal, self isolation, or unconscious rebellion that leaks out in inconsistent or hard to read behavior. So when Mars in the 12th house becomes conscious, the person stops being unconsciously driven by what is hidden and starts developing a real relationship with the deeper forces moving inside them. They become less vulnerable to self undoing, more aware of what their energy is actually doing, less ruled by buried frustration, and more capable of giving their will a grounded form, less likely to disappear inside inner conflict, and more able to work with solitude, intuition, and spiritual depth without losing themselves in it. That's when displacement becomes powerful. Because now the hidden fire is not just leaking out through confusion, it becomes available. Now solitude is not just escape, it becomes integration. And now spiritual sensitivity is not just overwhelm, it becomes discernment. So if the chart is an inner cosmology, Mars in the 12th house tells us that the fire of action is moving through the unseen realms of the psyche. So it shows up where the person is learning to understand hidden motivations, to work with unconscious anger, to integrate buried desire, and to develop a more conscious relationship with the inner forces shaping their life. So the work here is not to become louder, it's to become clearer. Because Mars in the 12th house is not just about hidden anger or blocked action. It's about learning how to bring unconscious fire into conscious relationship so that your energy stops working against you and starts moving for you. So hopefully this gave you a deeper way to understand Mars in your chart. Because Mars in the houses is not just showing you where you take action on the surface. It's showing you where your fire lives within your inner cosmology, where your energy moves, where your instinct activates, where your desire, your anger, your will, and the drive begins to express themselves through your life. And that's really the deeper point of astrology. It's not just describing external events. It's revealing the architecture of your inner world, how your energy is patterned, how your psyche moves, and what you're here to become more conscious of. So if you want to go deeper into this work, I host a free shadow work circle every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. It's a space to explore your patterns and your inner world and your shadow in a deeper, more intentional way. So if you want to join, just go to my website at starwellastro.com. And if you're looking for a more personal approach, I offer personal natal chart readings and one-on-one shadow work guidance. So if you feel called to go deeper, everything is linked on my website, starwellastro.com. So thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you again next time. Bye.